Can you introduce yourself again?
My name is Mitchell Szcz. I work as a software developer here in Chicago, and also I'm involved in a lot of stuff involving media and politics and economics, various groups in Chicago as well.
So this has been a big year for media activism. What have we achieved this year?
This year, 2006, I think we've achieved what could be the beginnings of a positive development in the future trajectory of not only the internet, but on media technologies and media paradigms that are built on the internet. And I think that a lot of people might think of me as being a little bit overly optimistic, but I don't think so, especially if you're talking as far as the policy sphere of stuff, where it's gone, where people have actually, we can point to tangible things that have actually happened in Congress, at the FCC, in various court or other regulatory bodies. It has basically been so far stopping bad things from happening, which isn't necessarily the same thing as forcing or promoting good things from happening. Although I think that in this case, stopping this bad thing from happening has been very fruitful for the possible flourishing of some very good things to happen down the road. Putting some meat on these bones, I'm talking specifically about the formal rewrite of the Telecommunications Act in the United States. It's the main law concerning media and the internet in the United States. It's a law that does not get rewritten very often, and it was up for a rewrite in 2006, mainly to try to basically hand over television technologies and internet potential over to a small number of very well-connected cable and telecom companies, who usually, through sheer dint of their lobbying muscle and financial resources, almost always get what they want. But not in this case. And the reason that was the case is because people knew about what they were trying to do and organized to spread the word about what they were trying to do, rammed through laws that would have had detrimental effects to practically everyone else that was not connected or funded by these major, massive corporations, and stop that from happening for the most part. We've been able to successfully play defense in preventing this bad law from getting passed. Doesn't necessarily mean that a good law may fill that void in its place, but it's easier to fill that void when there is a void than if there's already something in place. It's very hard to dislodge that. So that's been the big thing in 2006 that I think we've achieved, and that I think would, especially where a lot of people thought that this would have been near impossible to achieve, maybe impossible to achieve, just at the beginning of the calendar year. And in fact, people who have had a lot of experience with these things have told me and others in point blank to our faces that we're doing the impossible, or trying to, and yet it's happened, and precisely through the tried and true recipe of preventing these issues, which are usually handled behind closed doors with nary any press coverage or public awareness, into making them public issues. So that's one, and probably the biggest thing that we've achieved in 2006, in which I feel will have positive repercussions not only in this year, but perhaps for decades, in ways that I think we speaking now can't yet foresee. The other big thing, or a number of other big things that I think were in the offing in 2006 media related, it concerns the Federal Communications Commission and their reopening of their controversial media ownership rules, where in the United States the main body concerning media, television, radio, newspapers, the internet to some extent, music, movies, things like this, newspapers and magazines as well. Rules are in place now where no company can own a given amount of these in any given city or general vicinity. And that's good because that offers a reasonable diversity of one's media in a given area. But as far as the companies themselves, they would want to concentrate where companies could basically own as much as they would want or they feel may be able to profit from. And that's a mention of the rules that the FCC lays down or implements. In 2003, the FCC tried to implement this, and it failed. Again, to the tried and true recipe of people, even small communities, as little as even 5 people in a single room, knowing about this and doing everything they can to help make it an issue. And it made it an issue, and is to no small extent helped to prevent those rules from stopping, from becoming, making things a whole lot worse. In the course of 2004 and 2005, there had been some motion of court rule and some motion again at the Federal Communications Commission to move this along. In 2006, it actually has now gained muster where they are revisiting these rules. And in recent weeks, in fact, there have been extraordinarily well-organized public opposition to the FCC trying to make things a whole lot worse, where historically for the last 80 years their job has basically been to basically spoon-feed lots of profits to a small number of media companies in relative public obscurity. But that's not the case anymore. They are now under the gun from a wide array of public and civic society organizations, groups, and individuals to keep the media and these rules that help to shape our media environment reasonably diverse and reasonably open. So these are the 2 things I think in 2006 that we can point to, and that is cause for, I think, positive developments in the future.
What are the biggest issues ahead of us?
Biggest issues ahead of us here in Illinois, I think the biggest issue might be the main law concerning the media and the internet in the state of Illinois. The Illinois Telecommunications Act is scheduled for a rewrite in 2007. And that's going to be a big terrain of struggle, especially since a lot of these same cable and telecom companies that have, for the most part, failed to try to ram through their profit-oriented agenda in 2006 at the federal level are now going state by state by state, have succeeded in some states, and have failed in others. But where they failed, it's always because people have known about what's coming and have worked to spread the word about it, to build a firewall of opposition to stop it before it happens. And I think that's going to be the terrain of struggle here in Illinois in 2007 to make sure that the consumer protections and relative freedom and also the rules in play to allow for reasonably diverse media, if they change, they should change for a greater public benefit and not toward the benefit of a small number of very well-heeled, very well-connected, very well-funded media, telecom, and cable corporations in the state that serve the state of Illinois. So I think that's going to be the terrain of struggle. There's been some success on this in that just 2 years ago, a similar victory was achieved. So we can at least point to recent history and say, look, this has happened before, we can do it again. I think that's going to be where the big terrain of struggle will happen. The other thing I think that will happen will be the continuing of the struggle at the FCC for the media ownership rules that will at some point perhaps come to a head in 2007. And there it's the same boring old but tried and true recipe of spreading the word about this issue to prevent these issues that themselves by their own inertia have a way of congealing behind closed doors without very much public awareness or press coverage to make them public issues, that they impact the public, therefore everyone involved with these issues should know about these issues and work to have a say in them. And that's going to be, I think, the next realm of struggle. We've been successful so far in the last 3 odd years in doing so, and I think that needs to spread and ramp up. And also, I think struggles regarding the trajectory of the internet, and how it's being built within communities in the United States. Certainly here in Chicago, there's been a proposal for a citywide wireless internet network that, at least on the face of the proposal, is not terribly optimistic as far as, at least not terribly positive, I think, as far as the public involvement and public control of what winds up coming as this internet realm, that we're able to get reasonably high speeds at fairly low cost with a fair amount of technical competence and control over the decisions that are made to help shape and build that. and unfortunately, given the state of Chicago politics now and historically, that wasn't much of a surprise. But that's also, I think, another realm of struggle in 2007 to help to do the work to spread, to, again, make this a public issue, saying, look, other communities can do it in a positive realm, we should do it here in Chicago as well.
What have Chicago media activists achieved this year?
What have Chicago media activists achieved this year? I think the biggest thing that Chicago media activists have achieved this year has been to basically work in concert with other groups around the country in achieving the national things that I've spoken about earlier, the kinds of achievements at the federal level, certainly spreading the word about a lot of issues. As far as local things to point to, I'd probably have to think about that, maybe not a whole lot, but I think that fostering these ties can be useful because in a lot of ways the struggle that a lot of people carry on elsewhere impacts what goes on here and vice versa. So whenever there are alignments and strategic orientations and shared work on that front. I mean, I'll actually mention an example that I had the good fortune of actually suggesting. Yeah. I'll mention one example of a positive thing that happened here in Chicago. On May 24, 2006, activists in at least 5 cities in the United States created what they call the National Day of Outrage. It was this day of protest and organizing and outreach regarding basically the Telecom Act and the ramifications that would have on community access control of television and the trajectory of neutrality of internet communications. So that there wouldn't be discrimination of content for preferential buyers or sellers. And there was a protest here in Chicago that I and about 30 people had taken part in on Congress Parkway with 2 huge banners where a lot of people saw these banners during rush hour, where a lot of people, a lot of cars, and easily thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people had seen this. Plus also the accompanying media coverage related to this action, in concert with all these other things. This entire national project was a Chicago idea. In fact, actually, I'll take credit for this. It was my idea. I suggested this at a meeting of Chicago Media Action, one group I work with, and it caught on. I suggested the idea to a number of other national scale organizers in the course of 3 emails that basically took on a life of its own. And before I knew it, this one idea in a meeting of 3 people suddenly became a national day of outrage that may have laid the groundwork. Still too soon to sell, but still too soon to tell. But all signs, at least for the moment, suggest that that may have helped to shape the trajectory that could shape maybe the future of the internet and perhaps the future of the media, not just in Chicago, maybe nationwide, maybe worldwide. So maybe a small thing we can hang our hat on here in Chicago.
So to some extent, Chicago is a hub of media organizing, and what is the prospects of the FCC bringing their hearings here?
Yeah, the FCC, well, the talk about Chicago and a hub, yeah, there have been a number of groups that have not only produced media, but have also been working on media policy sphere. Should be more, and I hope that there will be more in the offing of all scales and interest groups and constituencies. And one aspect of Avenue, I suppose, will be to further the efforts to make that happen. The prospects of an FCC hearing happen here, well, remember that in the past month or so, there have been hearings, one official, one unofficial, in the 2 largest cities in the United States. We're number 3. And so there's that trajectory there, that if they want to go to some place where there are a lot of people, we're next on the list. But the fact that there's also a lot of organizing that goes on here in Chicago may mean that a lot of the well-heeled corporate interests and their allies in the FCC and in certain political offices and courtrooms might not want to have it here because we're so pretty well organized. So I guess it could be a toss-up. It could go either way in that count. And if it comes here, we'll be ready. If it doesn't, we'll see what we can do to help alliances elsewhere in the Midwest or wherever they may be to help to support these efforts.
Why should someone who hears what you're saying get involved in media activism, and how could they get involved?
Why should people get involved on these issues that I've been talking about? Well, the biggest thing is that no matter what you are, no matter what your interests are, no matter what you do, no matter where you might be, you consume media in the lion's share of your waking hours every day of your life. Estimates in the United States are something upwards of 12 hours a day of media of any form that people consume. And therefore, questions about who produces that, who has a say in how it's produced, why it's produced, to what ends, and also the various economic and policy, political dimensions that go into not only the asking of those questions, but the ultimate answering of them. It impacts you in ways that are far more tangible than an admittedly abstract and detached policy one conversation like I've been having here, presentation like I've been having here may suggest. So yeah, it impacts you in lots of different ways, especially since you produce this media, and the policy decisions ultimately help to shape the media that you consume. So yeah, if you use media, this impacts you. And so getting involved is important. How can you get involved? There are lots of different ways. One would be, and in fact, probably the first, well, I'll suggest a number of ways. One would be to, at the very first level, and probably the most important level, be informed on these issues. Find out about them. There are a number of excellent books that are out there. The writings of Robert McChesney, an Illinois guy, it turns out, on the faculty of the University of Illinois, has written a number of books on these and related topics. His writings are excellent and talk about these details and these questions in great detail, and also point to a lot of other writings that talk about and wrestle with such serious questions like this. There are plenty of excellent websites: Chicago Media Action, Free Press, Media Channel. I'm probably thinking of could probably think of more others if I were to think on it some more. And other groups that are working on such similar issues are providing, and already provided on the internet, freely available, lots of information about these issues, for which people can learn about them and stay educated on these issues, especially as they change and will continue to change over time. The second thing would be to speak to elected officials about these issues. A lot of the success that we've had in the policy sphere has been because of waking the sleeping giant, as it were, where, and in fact this actually had been mentioned in internal memoranda and in the business press of a lot of these corporations, of what is termed the ultimate weapon. If there's one thing that can be said about the popular movements and the struggles that I and others have been involved with, is that we hold in our back pocket what they term to be an ultimate weapon. That is, involvement of the public. And that's ultimately a lot of what these struggles basically become a race on, is can we tell enough people about what's happening in time, so that in so doing they then contact their elected representatives or whomever and say, don't do this, to sufficient numbers that they have no choice but to obey to these rules. And ultimately, a lot of the struggle that I and others have been involved in media politics in recent years has been that of a race. Can we spread the word on these before these horrible rules or horrible regulations or horrible decisions that are sometimes very hard to reverse get implemented? And that's one thing that I would suggest people doing, to contact their elected representatives in whatever ways. They count those rules, and they have made decisions on that basis, sometimes very serious decisions. They have had impacts and will have impacts in ways a lot of us probably have just scratched the surface to explore. And the third thing I would suggest that people do about these things, spread the word about them. Another crucial development about this ultimate weapon that I've been talking about is that the media are in a unique position to basically control the public awareness, or greater public awareness, about the politics of their own industry. So then that accords activists like me and others the unique challenge of, how do we talk about the media without using the media for the most part? And there have been ways around that. The internet has actually been a fantastic boon about this. Public events, like protests, like hearings, like gatherings, like simple meetings in a cafe on a Friday night, have been very fruitful as far as helping to spread the word about these issues. And a lot of media have themselves community media initiatives, radio shows, podcasts, websites, blogs, community newspapers. The list goes on, of people using that media to talk about the media and the decisions that are made by them. And so that's the last and also crucially important thing that I would suggest people do. But it's also very simple. Talk about these things. Spread the word. It makes them quiver in their boots.
Why does it seem so impossible to reverse the bad decisions once they're made?
That has to do a lot with the inertia of a lot of things. Not the least of which is that when laws are passed, usually there are accompanying institutions that are funded and supported by these rules that kind of protect these rules so that any kind of changes make it all that harder to try to make. I'll mention one example. In 1934, the Communications Act in the United States was passed. It cemented the commercial orientation of media, radio at the time, in the United States, which ultimately helped to suggest to further the trajectory of a commercial orientation to television, and that medium came to fruition about a decade and a half later. The commercial interests that benefited from that would then use their money to support various lobbying initiatives, most notably the National Association of Broadcasters, probably the main lobby group on behalf of the commercial media interests, whose job basically is to promote their own interests, cast a nice light on them, and play hardball in the lobbying and political sphere when they need to. And with a lot of people involved with that and a lot of money and a historical precedent where they can point to serious victories, where they can oppose serious numbers of people who had been organized. Trying to overcome that kind of barrier that has been put in place as a result of these rules makes the rules themselves all the harder to try to change. So that's another realm in the struggle that we've unfortunately been forced to have to wrestle with. But again, public exposure of these issues has helped to go a long way toward this, to let people know, look, see what's going on with your word and with your name and in your name and with your tax dollars and this kind of implicit tacit support of all of these arrangements that you're basically screwed over by. And they say they're serving the public interest, and in the public interest, convenience, and necessity, to borrow the FCC's founding phrase, going back to the FCC's own charter. But as far as where the rubber hits the road and where that's actually implemented into practice, it's a very different state of affairs. But that can be changed, and that's what activists like I and others are working to do here in Chicago and around the country.
How did you get engaged in this subject to begin with? Was there a defining moment? Was it a slow awakening?
How did I get involved in this? It was both a defining moment and something of an awakening. The defining moment for me personally was, ironically enough, speaking on media, a TV show I happened to watch that happened to talk about the trajectory of increased concentration of media ownership in 1992. At the time, we had only about 25 companies that commanded the lion's share. Now we're down to about 5. At that time, it would seem like paradise. But that news report I had seen basically mentioned two things. One was that there was this increased concentration of media ownership, fewer and fewer companies holding more and more media properties, and the trajectory being toward fewer and fewer owning more and more, to the point where the prediction by the end of the decade, by the year 2000, would be down to about 6. And that's exactly what happened. And the other thing that was reported on this TV show was how this state of affairs would impact what gets covered, or what doesn't get covered, or what gets emphasized, or what gets de-emphasized or belittled, if it gets mentioned at all. And so that was a defining moment for me, a TV show I happened to know and I later got the good fortune to ultimately be a part of in Michigan, where I grew up.
So
But
this was a local show?
This was a local show.
And how old were you?
I just graduated from high school. I was about 18. And I happened to watch this show, and it had a really defining impact on me. it had a defining impact, I think, on my way of thinking on things. But it didn't really have a defining characteristic as far as my overall actions. That took a lot longer to do. I think mainly because there may have been a little bit of hesitancy on my part, perhaps some familiarity on my part, because I was walking into uncharted waters. I mean, you can think different thoughts, but as far as translating that into tangible actions in your everyday life, a little harder to do. Try quitting smoking sometimes and you see the point. But ultimately, I took the plunge on that. And that was probably a long series of, wrestle with decisions of my own, to the point where now I'm coming up on the 4-year anniversary of me having gotten into these issues in a very tangible way in my everyday actions, and also in the hopes of setting an example. And also, I suppose, a matter of patience, but also in a surprise that, especially since a lot of these things, there may be that kind of time that needs for that kind of awakening, not only of such issues, but also of a readiness, steeling yourself, as it were, in a lot of ways to prepare yourself for when you do take the plunge, and ultimately do get involved on these issues in whatever way you may choose how to. But there's also the matter of not only of a patience about these issues, but also of an awareness that things can change very rapidly, to a trajectory that a lot of people may not foresee coming. The kind of a growth pattern, as it were, of exponential, where suddenly you go from like very small, really little, really tiny, that it steadily keeps growing, and then you reach some tipping point, and then it shoots up dramatically. And I think you can point to examples within the activist sphere of where this has happened, where suddenly it's like the old saying, it took me 10 years to become an overnight success. And so, yeah, I suppose the activism realm kind of mimics that as well.
This has only taken you 4 years.
It's only taken you 4 years. So.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.